Dr. Robbins, someone asked or said, it seems like the novels you have highlighted so far concern ethnic or cultural transitions and boundary crossing.
Good
Does
question.
this genre lend itself to these kinds of stories?
That's a great question. I think that one, and I'm going to combine that with another question of the recreation of, narrative into graphic form. I think one of the things that's happening with the graphic narrative form, March being a great example, right? The John Lewis text and Takai's revisiting of the Japanese American internment history is that if we're trying to get kids to really immerse themselves in history, we need to make it accessible. And if we want them to identify with historical experiences that other people have had that they aren't having themselves, the visual medium is a really powerful way of doing that. And I think that's one reason why we're often seeing the graphic narrative form, trying to do that work. And also seeing the graphic form being used as an adaptation of something that was originally written in another form, like Handmaid's Tale. And another example I would give, I teach transatlantic literature, so I'm learning more about Caribbean and Canadian literature than I was taught when I was in school myself. And one of the texts that I love is Ruffing It in the Bush, which is a narrative about settling in the backwoods of Canada. And the author of it, Susanna Moody, is often sort of touted as the mother of Canadian literature. Well, that book is like this thick, and it's one of those books I've taught excerpts. I've literally never taught the whole book. But there's a relatively new graphic narrative of that tale that is just really powerful. And it really helps you imagine what it would be like to be living in the backwoods, away from urban centers. So I think part of the power of it is just, the power of picture and the way that picture works. And you'll see when we go in the breakout, I think there's a potential connection between photography and drawn graphic narratives. So I often use photographs, for instance, from Dorothea Lange's time that she spent at the Japanese American internment camps, and that she spent in the areas where the Okies were living and people from Texas were living in California, during the Dust Bowl era. Those individual pictures, those individual photos often tell stories in and of themselves, and then the sequencing of them is an activity that I often ask students to do to create a more detailed, complex story by using the photographs. Let's see.
Someone else had a question about providing historical context, so that students understand the history or the topics behind the narratives, and how much of that do you do?
So I tend to do it sort of like we did tonight. I do it through the literature initially. So for instance, I don't give a 30-minute lecture on the Holocaust before we start Mouse. I start with the visual imagery, and then I build historical, knowledge as we work our way through the narrative. Because I'm an ELA teacher, right? And I like to tell people often that I do historical work, but I'm not a historian. And I co-teach with historians sometimes, and I'm always struck by the way that they always want to front load the history. And I'm very reluctant to do that. I like to let the language work do its magic, as it were, and then weave in the history along the way. Let's see, graphic novels for ELLs. That's an excellent question. I think that's a great strategy because they're learning words, and words sometimes get in the way of understanding, where images can sometimes do the work. And one of the things I love to do, and I mentioned Margaret earlier, my middle school teaching daughter. Her first few years of teaching, she was doing ELL, and one of the things that she used to do was to use picture books, for elementary age readers, to get her, to get her kids reading. I want to recommend The Arrival, which is an incredible picture book about immigration, and it's set in a sort of magical realism setting. It was written by an Australian author. There's visual moving picture versions of it that have been put on YouTube. So the book again is called The Arrival, and I'll post it in our shared space later. But I think using picture books is just a really great way to work with ELL learners. When Renee works with us next week, she's going to bring Fried Bread as one of the texts that we're going to look at, and it's a great example of something that that I'm doing now. I'm using picture books with my grad students because I want to get them pulled back from words. They're almost too immersed in dense sentences, and I really want them to think about the power of imagery. So I think that's a really important strategy. And thanks for posting that. And be sure and go to YouTube and look at the different ways that people have turned that text into moving video. And there's even a symphony now based on that narrative. It's fantastic. On the African-American writers, I'm going to alert Brandon that that's a question that he should address the night that he comes and is with us. The one that I taught that I mentioned earlier is Nat Turner. And it's truly powerful, but it's certainly not the only one. So we'll want to get some more together to share with you that night, and also I'll post some.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robbins. We had more questions, and I know that we all could